open standards for risk data. We've got 2.5 hours slated for this, so lots of time for discussion. I just want to flag that we'll be recording the meeting from this point, including trying to record the breakouts as well, just so we can capture the discussion and properly synthesize what's been raised today. Okay. Hopefully everybody can see my screen. Please shout in the chat if you can't. So we've got several people contributing to the presentation before we go to breakout. So I'm just going to kick things off with some overview slides from Dicky and from Pierre to describe GFDRR and the Open Data Standards Initiative, then go back to give some background to the workshop and describe the agenda in full before we dive into some more detailed presentations. So if you can pass over to Dicky just to give a background to ODS, please, and then on to Pierre for GFDRR. Thanks.
Thank you, Stu, and thanks to everybody else. So we wanted to just give a little bit of background and as to why this makes sense, or why hopefully you all feel it makes sense. And between us, both organizations, GFDRR and OASIS, we've been curating these open standards. And it's interesting that I think the logic behind this, while most people would get it, perhaps it is worth briefly stating. And overall, the most important thing is that if we don't have effective standards that sit around all the goals and objectives that we want on a daily basis, we would be in a sort of state of anarchy. The world operates by these standards. But I think many times we often sit there and think it's somebody else to do these things. And the short answer is, I think we've discovered, many of us, that actually it's important that we sort of do these things too. Sorry, I'm just trying to see if I can remove the echo that I've got here. So hopefully that's a bit better. So the two main reasons are efficiency, but obviously since we're talking about developing nations and GFDR's involvement here too, we're talking about saving lives. So those are the two reasons why this all makes sense. And it's really important, I think, that we all sort of get behind this and do what we can to make sense. But it has to be practical. So particularly when we get to the breakout, it's really important that we think about what actually makes sense. So not just trying to combine these standards because it's some goal that says we just got to bash these things together. It has to be around sort of making sense and specific the detail there. But of course, we want to be ambitious about this because it really matters. So I think those are the most important things. And OASIS has been curating the open data standards now for some time and beginning to expand them into many other lines of business, as we would say in the insurance industry. Liability is the last one we're just working on, and then I think cyber is going to be next. And I hope everybody can get something out of today in collaborating together to make this work. So, Pierre, Stu, back to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dicky. So yes, Stu, if you can move to the next slide. So I'm Pierre Chonowski, and I'm leading this risk data library project on behalf of GFDRR, so the global facility for disaster reduction and recovery. And I think so. And thanks again, Dicky, for your candid introduction. I think actually it's probably the first time we have such a technical workshop bringing together stakeholders from the private sector, insurance, academia, but also the development sectors to talk together about disaster risk information. And for us as an institution, part of the World Bank, as you know, it's really important because of course we can do a lot. We have a lot of convening power, but as you know, we can't do it alone. And so we have been working on making disaster risk information more easily and accessible for developing countries for the past 10 years with the innovation labs at GFDRR. But still, we have lots of barriers, and one of the barriers that Dicky just mentioned is about it's kind of reducing that marginal cost or also reducing the frictions, so that what we do with the high-income countries on providing very high-resolution, granular level risk information can also be done in some way for the most marginalized, for the poorest of this planet. And so this is really what matters to us, and why we do our work at GFDRR. And I think it is really great to have you all here today to work on that together. But because again, it's really not something that one can achieve alone. And yeah, so I'm again very happy to have you all, and wish you a very interesting and successful workshop. Thanks.
Sorry, everybody, struggling to change slides and unmute in a timely way. Okay, so some background to the workshop. As Dickie and Pierre have just mentioned, you know, there's been risk data standards developing in parallel. Two main driving sectors, being development sector and the private sector, and the RDL has been developed through a series of public sector funding challenges, and the ODS standards being developed through consortium of insurance firms. But there's more than just those two audiences. So we see the value in this in humanitarian, in broader climate finance, anywhere that's using risk data. So it's time to really bring this conversation to more people, bring the conversation between the two sectors together as these applications are converging. The applications of ODS and RDL are looking at similar solutions, similar data, similar types of models. There's large amounts of, or increasing amounts of overlap in the aims and needs for these standards. So the objectives of this workshop really strengthen commitment across the two projects and more broadly to open risk data standards. Have a look at areas of synergy between the needs of the users of the risk data library and of the Open Data Standards Initiative, and to together develop a collaborative roadmap to improve those risk standards, and in doing so promote the sharing of risk data and open modelling for climate and disaster risk. So as Dickie mentioned, we're going to be looking at some practical suggestions to harmonise those data standards where they're appropriate, and is the potential for a common open risk data standard framework. And that includes looking at standards in existence elsewhere for parts of risk data. We're aware of multiple standards dealing with different bits of risk data, so where can we align and bring those together as well? So the agenda, we're going to spend say the next half an hour or so looking at key concepts and familiarising everybody with the risk data library and ODS. We'll take a short break, allowing us to move everybody to the breakout rooms. Please, if you can let us know on the Google form we provided in the invitation. Hopefully the link in the chat that I posted will also take you to that Google form. If you can let us know which breakout room you'd like to join, then Pierre will be transferring you to those breakout rooms during that 5 minutes. So in those breakout rooms, we'll be discussing one of 4 topics. There's one room looking at open standards for hazard data, one looking at open standards for infrastructure asset data, one on socioeconomic vulnerability, and one on open standards for results data, so modelled impact and losses. And discussing in those rooms core areas where we can harmonise and where the needs lie. And then we'll come back after those breakout rooms to reconvene, and the moderators from each of those sessions will summarise the findings and we can kick on with a discussion from there. So we'll start with a few definitions, so we're all thinking along the same lines. And Lee Dodds, who's working with us on the risk data library, will give a few definitions to standards and interoperability. And Lee, if you just want to give a very quick intro to your background in standards, that would help as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone. So my name is Lee Dodds. I have worked in and around various open standards for quite a few years. Most recently, I was leading a number of projects at the Open Data Institute here in the UK that was involved in both developing open standards for sharing of data, but we also put together a guidebook to support communities in developing open standards for a whole range of different purposes. So we just wanted to very briefly just start off with just a couple of definitions, just to make sure that we can have a productive discussion through the rest of the workshop. So we're obviously talking about standards today. What you can see on the slide here is the definition of an open standard for data that we included in the ODI guidebook. So we describe them as documented reusable agreements that can help us to publish, access, share, and use better quality data. There's a few important elements to that. Firstly, the agreement part, because it implies that standards are created by communities like the people on this call coming together to agree on the best ways to consistently share data. They're reusable in the sense that they're not designed for a specific application or a particular project. They're designed to be used in different contexts, so across communities, across different systems. And importantly, they're documented to make them actionable so that people can use them repeatedly in different projects. If you could move to the next slide, please, Stu. One of the things I've noted around the conversations around open standards is that very often people are agreeing on the need for standards, but then have very different conception of what it means to create a standard or what the standard should cover. And that's because we can standardize a whole range of different types of things. We can standardize the data formats and APIs that allow us to exchange data between systems. We can standardize the data models and taxonomies and the concepts that we use across different systems so that we can organize and manage data consistently. And we can also standardize how we go about collecting data, so the protocols that we use to consistently capture data so that we can use it in a variety of different ways. And often we need all of these different types of standards if we're building a system. And what's often the first thing we need to do is understand what existing standards exist that we can build on, and where there are gaps, or where do we need to bridge between different standards so that we can build the systems that we need to actually solve real world problems. If you can move on to the next slide. So as well as standards, there's interoperability. So interoperability is the ability for products and systems to easily exchange data. And the way that we create interoperable systems is by adopting common standards. So we build systems out of different components that conform to standards. And that makes us easy. It makes them easier to, in some cases, literally plug them together. One of my favorite examples of standardization is the electricity system. So the wiring, the voltages, the fuses, and the plugs that we all have in our homes and places of work, there are different standards for all of those different elements. But we combine them to create a system that, for the most part, you don't have to think about what you're using. You can move your devices between different buildings, different locations, and plug them in and be confident that they will just work. There's obviously times when that doesn't happen, when we go to other countries and they have different standards for the shapes of plugs. And so we need to invest in adapters and transformers that will mean that our equipment still works. Now, in the world of data, we're often in a situation where things aren't that easy, that data isn't consistently organized or easy to access. And so what we're often doing is trying to increase interoperability by standardizing those different components. Yeah, so that was my quick overview.
Over to me, I guess. Okay. Thanks a lot, Lei. So based on what Lei just discussed and introduced on what actually is a standard, I'm going to try to define what exactly we want to do with the disaster risk library, risk data library. Sorry. So, well, it is a standard. Let's say that it first that's a commitment. We want to support standardization of disaster risk data, and we want to do that because we have some issues. So the first issue we have at the bank, but also in the development sector, is that we have lots of data, risk data produced through disaster risk assessment, for instance, but they are not well archived. They are very difficult to find when the project is over, very difficult to reuse because obviously countries are different, projects are different, and so on. So we needed a way to be able to combine all those different risk data that in the end are about improving awareness and understanding of disaster risk. So this is why we started to work on that project, and this is also for us a way to support clients, to support countries, to support partners, to also share those risk data information in a better way. So it's very important, and I think that's why we also decided to call it a standard. We could have decided just to deploy our own infrastructure and say, okay, let's use that and don't forget about the support to standardization. But actually, we see both as really interconnected in the sense that if we want to provide more risk data to our users, we also want to make sure that they can replicate the work. And for that, you need to communicate about the standard, not only about the data infrastructure. So for us, really, the risk data library is both about deploying and providing services so that users can store, find, search for, exchange disaster risk information, but it's also about having that common framework so that people can improve collaboration. So next slide, please. So yeah, so I mean that's a very simple overview of what we like to achieve. I would say an idealistic overview, but basically, risk data library is trying to support combination on various types of risk data, right? So we have hazard data on one side, we have data on exposure, so population, infrastructures exposed to disasters. We have vulnerability, which is actually a function that is linking the exposure to a given hazard for a given location. And then we have the results. We have the results that come from models, risk models, that is what we call loss data. It can be also impact and so on. And so what we want to do is to provide a way to package all those information together, and also to support people to, so when, for instance, they're producing data on the population and where they're producing data from a disaster risk assessment, to be able for them to comply with that standard so that others can reuse the data. So it's really about creating that kind of pivot table, if you prefer, so that we can use various sources of risk information, which actually could be also sources from the humanitarian sector, from other sectors, and that are collecting data as well, and a lot of data, and so that it can benefit to disaster risk management applications. And when we are talking about applications, so we are talking about communicating the risk to the populations, to the decision maker, to conduct disaster risk assessment, country profiles, disaster risk assessments at facility level, and all that all those different, let's say, activities that are part of the disaster risk management spectrum. So next slide, please. Yeah, and finally, maybe a bit on actually how innovative is our offer. I would say, well, first of all, we have the fact that we are trying to support combination, as you understand, of different data types. And then for each of those data types, and that will be the topic of the breakouts, but just quickly to say that, so on hazard, what we support is a possibility to store multi-hazard processes, to store different scenarios, different footprints, to store cascading events. So when a hazard triggers another hazard. On exposure, we want to support multiple scales. We are using an existing taxonomy, but still exploring to include other type of exposures, such as, for instance, socio-economic exposures. On vulnerability, something that is very important for us, because I mean, vulnerability functions, for instance, are very difficult to find, or actually non-existent for many of the countries that we are supporting. So for us here, the objective is really to actually foster the generation of vulnerability data for developing countries. And for that, you need at least a way to find and compare what has already been done. And the last one on the losses and the results. So here we support. So it's let's say it's mainly for now it's mainly losses at aggregated level. So let's say at country, administrative, or graded point level, to be able to have information on the number of assets and related losses. But again, still discussions going on whether or not we should go to a let's say a facility level, for instance, something that our colleagues at OASIS are doing. And that will be my transition.
Okay, thanks, Pierre. Hi, everyone. My name's Matt Donovan, and I'm Program Manager at OASIS, and I work on lead the day-to-day work on open data standards. So I'll just spend the next few minutes telling a bit about it. I appreciate some people on the call are aware of it, especially those coming from an insurance or reinsurance market. So ODS was, or OED actually, what it was originally called in open exposure data, which we'll talk a bit more about later, was set up a few years ago to essentially break down the hurdles and barriers that have been in the reinsurance and insurance industry for probably the last 30 years around the use of exposure data, risk level data, and especially the transfer of data around the market. And the problem that has been, the major issue for the last 20-30 years is that we've been using, certainly for catastrophe modelling, proprietary data formats from the large 2 or 3 modelling companies who share the market on cat models. And the problem with that is that those proprietary formats are inefficient and costly when it comes to working with more than one of the data sets, transferring it around the market, like I said. And because of the resource, there's actually now a slight reluctance to adopt any multiple models or to look at any other data formats because it takes so much resource. So ODS was put together to break down those barriers, to keep exposure data and also results data consistent across models. And this has been adopted by the use of the OASIS loss modelling framework, which is an open source modelling platform, which is OASIS, a not-for-profit, and it's there to open up, it's open source and it's transparent, to open up more modelling choice to the market. And it's very much focused on the insurance and reinsurance industry. And so it's important to realise that ODS isn't an OASIS standard, it's actually a market standard, or it's a standard for the reinsurance and insurance industry, and it has been developed by the market for the market. So although it is adopted and it is used on all models on the OASIS platform, it isn't just for OASIS. And so the standard it offers, it's open source, it's model agnostic, so any models available through the OASIS platform will use the ODS standard, which is obviously a lot more efficient when it comes to using multiple models, analytics, validation, and transferring data across the market. And this covers the OED, which is open exposure data, and the ORD, which is open results data. And like I said, it just opens up transparency, and it just makes everything a bit more efficient and users of CAT models. Should we move on to the next slide, I think? And so just a bit on the capabilities. So like I said, it consists of OED and ORD, and what that means is that we have an open, consistent data format for exposure data, but also for the results data and what comes out of those models. So when it comes to analytics of multiple models, and when it comes to validation and use of multiple models, everything is consistent, and it breaks down that barrier of using, like I said, those proprietary and those different data formats around the market. So at the moment, there's essentially over 100 models on the OASIS platform, with, says it, 23 providers, all using the ODS standard, and it's the format that you sort of have to use that OASIS doesn't use, and you have to adopt that. And then the adoption and the take-up rate is increasing all the time. We've done a lot of market webinars, a lot of communication and collaboration with the insurance and reinsurance industry, and obviously events like this do help, and we're looking, obviously to expand that. ODS is governed by a steering committee made up of key attendees from insurance and reinsurance and modelling companies. We all get together 3 or 4 times a year to discuss and talk about how ODS, essentially what it's doing, and the day-to-day running and governance of that, any updates and anything we need to discuss. And OASIS chair that and curate it at the moment, but like I've said, it's not something that is an OASIS standard. It is very much an open market initiative for that. And it is very much focused on property cat business. We are looking to expand it out into liability, again for insurance and reinsurance, and then we're also expanding, looking at other lines of business such as cyber and things like that. But at the moment, it is very much for property cat business. And just reading this last point, it says here, one of the good things about it is it helps support developers or academics that want to build models and get their models out into not just the commercial market, but also like the disaster risk humanitarian projects out there. So having the OASIS platform being open source and transparent and the standard, it does help model developers and model vendors and academics who previously couldn't get entry to a commercial user base because of barriers and because of sort of reluctance to use other models. So the point of OASIS, and certainly ODS, is to open up that availability to other vendors and other model developers, and then it creates choice, and it makes everything a lot more efficient. And so that's all I was going to say about ODS. There are a lot of resources out there, and we have a GitHub repository and a website and everything, so you can get more information there. But just reiterating what some of the speakers have said previously is that there are, it's obvious that ODS and RDL have their different core users and their focuses, but there's definitely a lot of overlap and a lot of middle ground and a lot of opportunity to certainly come together, which is why we're all here, and hopefully we can, towards the end and after the breakouts, we can have some good key take-home points of how we take it forward together, because this just highlights how ODS shouldn't be restricted just to the commercial insurance and reinsurance sector. It should be used as far and wide as it can, and in the disaster risk forum as well, like RDL. So on that, I'll hand back to Stu or Pierre.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Matt. I think that's a perfect way to transition to this next slide. And here we've tried to use several applications, not by all means not all the applications, but this kind of is an attempt to represent where RDL and ODS sit and where this this overlap sits, but I think these circles are purposely dashed lines because they can move. They'll move through time. Some of these boxes or descriptions of applications will move between boxes and will appear in different areas of this chart depending on the country context, in terms of the data rich, data scarce, and depending on the context of application across development and insurance. So this comes back to the point we made earlier of applications evolving and the overlap in applications changing as we use different types of data and as we apply the standards and the models to risk financing, reinsurance, or more straightforward exposure assessments where we have limited data. So just a few of the examples there, and we may return to that later on. So we have several breakout topics lined up, but we've made quite good time on this first section. I wonder whether it's a good time to break just to take a couple of clarifying questions from anybody, if there are clarifying questions before we talk about the breakout topics. So if anybody wants to raise their hand and ask a question, then please go.
Yeah, and maybe so can you go back to the last slide, just a comment.
Yeah.
Because I think the topic of this workshop today is so as we all mentioned, it's about first finding commonalities, right? So about finding what are the bridges between those different initiatives, and actually it would be great to hear about your own initiative. But if you look at the slide, I think what also matters is those white areas, right? Where we have those gaps. And for instance, for the insurance market, it could be to widen the market so that we can reach new countries and we can work in more data scarce environment. Whereas, for instance, for GFDRR, it's really about also enriching actually the with data the countries that we are supporting. So just to say that, I mean, it's not like a rocket science, but to help us to try to identify also the gaps, not only the commonalities. Thank you.
Okay, any questions clarifying what we've spoken about before, this kind of high level scene setting? If not, we can go to introduce the breakout topics. So, as mentioned, we've selected 4 breakout topics, looking at open standards for hazard data, for infrastructure assets, for socioeconomic vulnerability, and looking at open standards for results, so impacts and modeled loss data. Each of these, the RDL and ODS, deals with differently and to different extents, but all are relevant to both standards, and obviously are core for risk analysis to address disaster risk management and risk financing. So we have had several discussions prior to this workshop, and these are the areas that we see are ripe for rich discussion around the use cases in private and public sectors, discussion around identifying the core capabilities that the standards need to address to be applicable across reinsurance, across sovereign DRFI, across DRM, disaster risk reduction, and humanitarian applications. And they're also all areas where we think there's potential for collaboration, but we don't want to decide that just between the 2 standards projects, and we want to open that discussion up. So we've selected these to focus on for around 45 minutes. What will happen now, while we just take a 5-minute break, is Pierre will assign people to one of those rooms, depending on your choice in the Google form. Looks like some people have had problems accessing that form, so if you haven't been able to access that form, please just type in the chat the name of the room that you would like to go to, and you'll be transferred automatically to the chat. Please don't disconnect from the call or leave the call. That will take you out of the call entirely. Once we're in the breakout rooms, the moderator will show a couple of slides and get the conversation going with some more detailed discussion questions and a bit more context around what the RDL and the ODS provides currently in that particular area. And after about 45 minutes, so let's say 30 minutes past 3 UK time, 30 minutes past 4 European time, we will reconvene to this main room, and the moderators and any other parties, moderators will summarize the discussion, and we'll open up broader discussion on any of those topics. Okay, thank you very much. Pierre, so let's take that break, and Pierre will start transferring us to the breakout rooms. Thank you.
I'm almost done, huh? Just bear with me. It's quite a process.
Especially when people are changing, I suppose, Pierre.
Yeah, I saw some, but I will do that after. Huh?
Okay. The joy of flexibility.
Up. Okay, so now is there people I can't find.
Hi, Pierre, it's Nico. Yes, if you can send the moderator, that would be great. This way we can upload our documents.
Yeah, but who are you missing as a moderator?
I'm not missing anyone. I'm in the main room still, so I can't. I'm not in the breakout room.
Oh, okay. Sorry, but I mean.
No worries.
I can't see you. That's weird. How do I do that? Sorry, Nico. I'm trying to.
No problem. We are early, so we have time. But because I'm the moderator, I don't want people to run away from my breakout room if they're in. Thank you.
But for instance, so. Okay, so I think, Nico, I think you.
Yep.
Okay, I see. Yeah, you should be already in the infrastructure room. So I don't understand exactly. Let me. Okay, no, I need to start rooms actually. That's why. Okay. It's not launched already. Let me do that now.
Yeah, that looks accurate. It says will be moved within the next.
Yeah, okay, good.
Pierre, can I get put into a breakout room? I just joined. I had another meeting.
Okay,
I'm not sure which one would be best, but I'm here now.
Okay. Let me put you in exposure.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, done. Okay, up.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Are we in a group or?
I was just about to ask the same thing.
Okay.
There doesn't seem to be a lot of us.
Yeah, I think we might be the leftovers. I was just about to text and ask the same thing.
Okay, great. I think we're still in the main session, actually.
Yeah. I did choose a group via the form yesterday.
So did I, yeah, so did I.
Yeah, I only did mine this morning, but
Shall we just say we're the special group? with the VIP section.
Yeah, what's our topic?
Open to suggestions, right?
Pierre seems to have gone as well. Or is he?
It says he's on hold on the right-hand side. If you click on the people button.
I'm trying to message him within here, but it's not.
No, we've kind of got. Yeah. Sure.
Hi, Stu, it's Nico. We are back from the infrastructure session.
Okay.
Yeah, I can see everybody coming back into the main room. Thanks, Nico. Okay, hopefully everybody's back now. I can see 30 or so people in the main room. Okay, let me share my screen again. All right, can everybody see the breakout reporting discussion slides? Yeah, okay, good. All right, thank you, everybody. Hopefully you had some good discussion on the individual topics in those breakout rooms. Sorry for the delays in getting everybody to the rooms. It proved more time consuming than it was when we tested that. And thanks for your patience. So what we propose now is that we've got 50 minutes left on the proposed call, which is a good amount of time. We propose to have up to 5 minutes just summarising the discussion from each breakout from the moderators, and please, if anybody else wants to add something to what the moderators describe, then please do put your hand up, and we'll invite you to add to that. And then Dickie will kindly moderate some discussion around the commonalities and gaps that have been discussed, where there's some gaps that should be addressed, and why those gaps need addressing, and how we might get to addressing those gaps. Are there pieces in any of those topics where ODS and GFDRR should collaborate in terms of these standards? Are there other standards that can be aligned with or brought together into a common standard framework? Open to hear any solutions, really, and help us to develop a collaborative roadmap going forward.
I see you. I think we are all back. Yeah. So sorry for those. I had to close the rooms, and so that we can reconvene. Okay. So anybody who missed the beginning of that, we'll just start with key points from each breakout. So Mattia, would you kindly present a summary of what you discussed within the hazard group, please? Thanks.
Yeah, sure. So we've been discussing the main differences between the risk data library and OASIS in the way the hazard is represented and stored. So while the OASIS framework includes the hazard intensity values as integral values within the asset footprints, we at the risk data library as a separate schema that describe independently the hazard footprint as a special data set, and both the systems have their own taxonomy, which matches with the UN taxonomy as well for the most, but there is space for improvement and to find a good compromise that works for everybody would be really nice. And we spoke about the limitations of these data sets, if we have any kind of geographical limitation, and both expected to have global coverage and different level of scaling, let's say from local to multi-regional. We discussed briefly the use cases, which of course can be quite different from our insurer, from a researcher to our insurer. So the kind of data they want to find and want to use. We discussed the additional details that should be included in the description of another dataset, which includes also some attributes that describe the way the hazard has been modeled, not just limiting to the name of the model, but to the parameters that have been used and other things. We discussed about the way to represent the uncertainty, which is different in the OASIS framework, which uses a continuous distribution of probability for each individual event, while the risk data library expected to have different individual footprints for different collection of data. So, for example, you will have one footprint representing the average, one representing the maximum, and one representing the minimum. So there are two different ways to convey the uncertainty, but I think that the risk data library can also adapt it for a more broad inclusion of the uncertainty. I think these are the most important point, but I'm looking at the notes. Yeah, these were the most important points, but there are a lot of notes. So let me look more into that, and maybe I will come later with anything I missed. Most of the comments were from Ben, which helped me describe the OASIS framework. So thank you, Ben.
Okay, thank you very much, Mattia. Maybe we can, if people can note anything they want to respond to or pick up in the broader discussion, that'd be great. Nico, please go ahead with infrastructure assets. Thanks.
Yes, I too. Thanks, and hi everybody. I think we have a very general but very interesting discussion in the sense that critical assets, it's an area that is pretty much in its infancy. However, particularly from the public sector perspective, there is a lot of demand to invest in that area. So we started by discussing the use cases, and so from a public sector perspective, generally governments are very interested, for example, in identifying the criticality of their assets, and in order to do that, you need to estimate the loss of service you would get associated with a natural hazard. And so collecting data on critical infrastructure assets is useful to perform modeling, and particularly cost-benefit analysis that would help prioritizing investment. And so those investments could be either in land use planning, so don't build a road should you retrofit in priority when you have only a limited budget. And also it could be used for risk financing. And by risk financing, that could be either allocating budget when you're the Ministry of Finance, or designing a risk insurance product. And that leads maybe to the private sector interest. So the general message was that the private sector and the insurance industry in particular does not really insure critical assets at the moment. However, there is an interest in doing so. So there's probably a common area where common work could be done. Now, when it comes to standards, well, there was not that many standards really that were discussed. So, I mean, obviously, for example, for road networks, there's the open street map data that is done. So the risk data library, of course, is investing into those aspects. So primarily collecting data on buildings, which is very common to perhaps commercial and residential buildings, but also on networks, so lines. However, there's not necessarily that many attributes that are collected. There was also discussion, of course, of the Inspire initiative that does also collect information on networks. And so in terms of what kind of attributes should be collected, I think we will come to the general but clear agreement that we need information on geolocation. And so the standard could be at various resolutions, starting from address or latitude, longitude, basically, but could also be aggregated at a subnational level and maybe a national level. Then, of course, I mean, maybe information on replacement value, which is fairly common to other areas, so we did not discuss too much that topic, but it is also an important aspect. But then more importantly, information on production, loss of service, and again, in order to identify critical assets. That's something that is perhaps maybe more unique to critical infrastructure, but absolutely essential. One point we did make was the difficulty we have when it comes to critical infrastructure to make the distinction between public assets and private assets, and how can we basically make that assignment. And so that's something that perhaps could be considered into a standard. So it leads us to basically the gaps, and why should we have a standard? Well, the gaps actually are pretty much everywhere, to be honest, because again, a lot of information should be collected, but again, particularly when it comes to loss of service information. What we came to a conclusion was that in order to develop a standard, well, of course, I mean, it's interesting to have development experts like the World Bank and insurance experts like our partners that we're discussing in the meeting, but it's not enough. We certainly need to invite the engineering community and the building community, because they're the ones who have worked in this area for much longer than all of us. And so we need to sit with them and agree how to basically collect data and what kind of metrics should be used. And so why? The why is, again, it's primarily to be able to share data and facilitate collaboration. And this would really help developing consistency. So consistency could be, for example, within a government, having various ministries using the same standard that allows them to basically share information. That's crucial, but also consistency across countries. For example, if you want to develop a regional product for an insurance pool or those sort of aspects. So please, I'd like to ask the team as well to step in if I missed or misrepresented anything, but I think that covers the discussion that we had for infrastructure. Thank you.
Thanks, Nico. Fantastic. Sounds like you had a very busy discussion. In terms of looking at socioeconomic vulnerability, I think we're in a situation with the RDL where we developed socioeconomic vulnerability capabilities in the context of building out a database schema, and haven't done as much active work on this area as we have the other areas in converting it and communicating it as a standard. So we're kind of in a slightly different place to thinking about assets and hazard data. So we had a good discussion, which I think concluded on the fact that we need to do more work on use cases for socioeconomic vulnerability. There was discussion that there's lots of indicators. Where should we focus our attention? What should we standardize? Should we look at a certain portion of socioeconomic vulnerability? There's different scales to look at socioeconomic vulnerability at. Should we be looking to standardize data at global level or subnational level? For example, GEM have been doing lots of work at the global level, and World Bank and GEM have been looking with similar methodologies potentially at the subnational level. But where should a standard focus its attention on? Where can it bring most value? And I don't think we're able to answer that question yet. Referencing the GEM work, GEM have created a taxonomy in producing the global socioeconomic vulnerability maps. UN SDG indicators provide an adopted and approved set of indicators that any standard should look to align with. Equally, JRC have been working on the Inform Index and are doing some work at the moment to attach those indicators to hazard layers and look at what vulnerability is dependent or independent of hazard processes. One thing that we discussed was potential value in the standard providing more clarity around what a social vulnerability data set contains. It's a very broad term. As we said, deals with lots of different indicators, and those things can mean different things to different groups and in different contexts. So in the context of GEM, they're looking at social vulnerability in relation to earthquakes. But can that data and the indexes that are developed for earthquake risk relate directly to vulnerability to flood risk? So we need to do more work to help people understand what is meant by a data set, what the outputs of a data set mean, and how can it be translated and used in different applications and different contexts. And so that potentially there's value in having a standard really clarify the development of the data, the content, the applicability to different contexts and different scales. And in terms of returning to doing more work on the use cases, it's clear that there's lots of people doing work in this area at the moment, and given the time frame since under the Risk Data Library project we looked at socioeconomic vulnerability in terms of developing the schema, there's potentially areas that have been moved on quite far since we did that. So I think the first step in socioeconomic vulnerability is to almost take a step back and look at what's been done 2-3 years down the line, look to see what the schema that has been developed under the different GFDRR challenge funds provides, and see whether it makes sense to improve that, or whether the Risk Data Library looks to adopt something else, or improve that schema with all the good work that's been done since. So I think there's lots of thinking to be done ahead on socioeconomic vulnerability. It's not a straightforward case of aligning with another standard or bringing in another taxonomy. I think it's a wholesale look at what is offered in what was termed the mover database, and seeing where we go from there with lots of different partners who are looking at this aspect of risk at the moment. And key among those would be UNDRR and the graph process, and GEM, UCL, who are maintaining a database of socioeconomic vulnerability and building on that through research projects at the moment, and as I say, JRC as well. So I think lots of valuable discussions to go ahead with, but I think nothing concrete at the moment before those discussions take place as to what direction we take on this aspect. Okay, I'll stop there, and if I can pass over to Matt Donovan, please, to deal with results. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stu. Yeah, so we had a pretty varied discussion, actually. Obviously, we were focused on results and losses, but we did actually discuss data, and we touched upon some of the things you've already talked about with your socioeconomic vulnerability and exposure data generally. And I think there was, and maybe Pierre can jump in at the end if I've missed anything, if I've not captured anything, but I think there was quite a big it sounds like there's quite a lot of interest and need for outputs not to be, and certainly from ODS and OID, not to be just focused on financial losses. And there seems to be, we had a couple of use cases discussed, and it seems to be there's a lot of interest in having an open standard for risk assessment, for disaster risk assessment, and maybe incorporate that into ODS where it isn't just looking at the financial losses. So one of the examples was things like displacement of people during a disaster recovery, and also looking at risk assessment and preparedness before and after an event. So one thing might be looking at the displacement of people during an earthquake and how close the shelter is, but also looking at, well, is that shelter actually robust enough to withstand an earthquake? So, it's very much looking at, well, the preparedness and taking on board what information is available before as a risk assessment, but also looking at afterwards as well. We had a Red Cross example, again, is very much disaster risk management, and it sounds like to me that we it will be linked to the hazard and the vulnerability schemas that RDL have done, having outputs based on that information. I mean, at the moment, the information you get out from ORD is very much dependent on the model that you've run and what that model covers in regards to information and data. And so we also, talked about, again, went to the front end and talked about we had an example of during a fire and explosion, and the data and the availability of the water supply, or how close the emergency services are and things. And although this is the front end, could we look at outputs, or could we look at information in the model losses or in the impact losses on how those aspects, and maybe you might call them secondary modifiers, where the more granular detail in the front end can actually be captured towards the back, again, for a more disaster risk assessment example. We talked about looking at a lot of data. We sort of did move around from model results, but there seems to be there's no clear standard for that during a humanitarian disaster, and it sounds like it's probably difficult to get all of that information into one standard. But I think we maybe should be looking at creating a use case, or looking at prioritizing what would be those key disaster risk management humanitarian outputs that could be incorporated into ODS. So it did cover quite a few things, and we didn't solely focus on results. But again, I think the outputs from this link obviously to the inputs, and it would be looking at how we incorporate those other breakouts, talking about hazard and socio-vulnerability, and what outputs we could get from linking to those schemas that RDL already have in place. I think there's clearly a need for ODS to incorporate as much of that non-financial insurance information in that, both in the front end and the back end, I would say. Again, we talked about experience, history. How do we capture what's gone on before? Again, that's relevant for both sectors. It was very much looking at the more humanitarian side, because I suppose the question would be, would that information be used in the insurance and reinsurance sector? I'm guessing probably not to that degree, but we're looking to expand this away from that and incorporate some stuff from RDL. So I think there's clearly an interest and a need for those outputs to be more non-financial. I don't know, Pierre, do you have anything to add on that? I'm just sort of going through my notes to make sure I've captured as much of that as possible.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Matt. Just maybe just to emphasize on what you said. I mean, actually, when we look at the results, I mean, we are talking about results, right? So we are already talking about an application of the other types of data. So in the way, we are already talking about something very specific that is even more closely linked to the use cases. And so what we actually discussed is that there are some use cases that are maybe not taken into account from the humanitarian angle. We also talked about preparedness, and so maybe there is here like a kind of stream of works to try to look at other use cases and how what should be the commonalities that OASIS, but also RDL should support. It's quite interesting on that. Also discuss how to connect to historical hazards and losses, for instance, from UNDR disadvantaged database. Something that we already discussed. I think it would be great to have an easier connection with those data, and also critical infrastructure. So how to go down to that level, and so very similar to what Nico said on supporting really all those different scales. So from the facility level to the almost nationwide level in terms of disaster risk management. So yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone for summarising. Dickie, can we pass over to you to drive the next 25 minutes of discussion? Thank you.
23. I'll allow you 2 minutes at the end, you and Pierre, to do something else. But thank you, everybody. And I think one of the things that when we looked at the list of people that had signed up, you represent, all of you, such a fantastic resource. So please forgive me for pushing you as hard as I possibly can to get each of you to reveal the nuggets of value and knowledge and experience that you got, because that's the least we could do, given the time you've given us all today. I've got a few questions that I thought would be useful to try and produce some useful conversations, and I may ask some of you independently to answer some of these. But the first one that strikes me listening to those summaries is, and maybe just 20 seconds of background. One of the challenges that the two organisations that have decided to curate these open standards face is keeping the momentum up within each of them, or collectively between them and others, to make sure that they live and are dynamic and therefore successful. So given that, my question would be, for anybody that feels they've got some experience here, is what other standards bodies or organizations do you think would be really important to help create that drive and that impetus that that may be represented here today, but we haven't explicitly talked to about trying to get more involved? Is there anybody that we're fundamentally missing? Is the questions, for example, OGS, ISO, some built environment standards, and in fact, maybe I'm wondering about, even though it probably doesn't, it's not even quite a standards organization, but we've got JRC on the call here today. So who else should we be talking to? Are we missing anybody that would be fundamental to the success, is my question. Perhaps I can slightly, I sort of was hoping that somebody with, I'm sure, lots of experience. Gustav, do you have some experience of this, given your position? And I just wonder if you have some ideas on this.
Me?
Yes.
Sorry. Not really, no. I can't say I do. Thinking about standardization, I'm not from this field initially, but I used to work with standardization within the nuclear field, and then we worked a lot with SENS and ELEC in Europe. But otherwise, I don't know if that's relevant for this conversation here. That was an implementation phase, so I'm not really sure. Someone said WHO, I think. This could be something, no?
Yes, I didn't have time to look at the chat. So WHO, is that one we should be talking to? Who and why? That doesn't sound stupid. I'm just asking a question because I think the why. Justin, I think you said that.
Hi, this is Justin. Yeah, it's actually WMO, not WHO.
Sorry.
Just because I know that. Yeah, I just know. I'm not sure if anyone is here from WMO, and if they are, I certainly don't want to talk for them. It's just that I was aware that they're moving more and more into this area and have interest in kind of humanitarian applications and risk modeling. So, given their role, internationally, I thought, with regard to standard setting for hazard data, they may be an interesting, stakeholder to engage for certain kinds of hazard states.
Justin, thank you. Good point. I was part of a working group that was working for them on trying to work out where they could interface with others. So I think that is a good point, actually. I think that's one we should take away. Any other organization? What about ISO? Anybody got an experience with ISO? We talked about that when we set this up, and we decided, we thought, we didn't know was a short answer, but probably not. But thoughts on ISO?
Maybe I can just come in for a couple of minutes. We've worked with them on a number of different standards, and they are in fact connecting to some of our work on hazard definitions and hazard profiles. But I think it may be a little bit early. It's usually easier when the standard is more or less there and cooked, and if needed, we would happily help connect to that, but it may be a little early, but we can share more experience. I've not been so directly handling that work, but I have colleagues who do and can definitely connect you. And we've definitely worked with them on some of the ISO standards for different types of hazard safety and hazard definitions.
That's interesting.
Sorry, I'm from UNDRR.
Thank you, Jenny. That's interesting. I sort of sense that makes sense without having too much knowledge. It makes sense. Anybody else on other bodies that we should be talking to? Okay, let's move on. I've got another question actually related perhaps partly to what Jency just said. One of the things that strikes me is, particularly listening to the conversation about the socio-economic breakout session, was are there some spaces where actually the immaturity of the environment that we're talking about is of such an early stage that actually it's counterproductive potentially to think about standardization when there's still so much development or so much development of the concept going on. So, you know, I almost thought I heard that being said, or maybe I did hear that being said. So is socioeconomic one that, even though we all think it's really interesting and important and is being looked at by both sides, mostly being represented here today, is that one where we should park it for a year or two because it's too underdeveloped, or is that a mistake because we can help its development? Any thoughts on that would be really appreciated.
I think for that one, if I can jump in, there's a case for definitely having a lot more discussion to work out whether that's the issue or not, or whether that's what we should focus on or not. I think it's a case of maybe understanding the state of the art a bit more, and then seeing where standards fit in before we take that decision.
That seems slightly intuitive from what I heard from your breakout. Anybody else got a view that's different from that? Okay, I think that is interesting because I think, is there any other areas we've talked about? I mean, infrastructure isn't the same at all. I don't think it does apply to infrastructure actually, but I mean, is there any other area other than socioeconomic areas which is possibly too immature to consider right now? I think we'll take that as a no then. Okay.
I think, Dicky, maybe the question on, I mean, as Nico mentioned, I think it would be worth exploring actually what has been done on the infrastructure side in terms of standardization and to what extent that we could connect to that, some things that we should take as a takeaway. Okay,
that's good. I've got a question I'm going to ask Nick Moody, who's still on. So I'm just giving him 30 seconds warning while I frame the question. So I thought one of the things I thought was interesting when we discussed, when we heard the breakout on results was, I think as expected, it ranged over a wide range of what results really are. And some of us have a bias towards heavily modeled results, which is the sort of background that one or two of us come from. But of course, we're talking here a very, very broad spectrum. And you only have to look at the newspapers in the last few days to hear, at least I read some articles by some people saying, you shouldn't describe the floods in Australia using language like it's a 1 in 100 year event because it's poorly defined and there aren't standards about describing it. But in fact, they were complaining about you shouldn't use that term at all. My view is that actually you should use it when it's qualified, because I think people prefer that language than the 99.8th percentile or something, which will bore most people in a sort of very short period of time. So, and interesting enough, of course, while the the standards that we're using are focused on model needs, really, we in the insurance industry use terminology to describe damage and loss results, if you like, in many, many different ways, in common with the rest of the world. So I thought that was interesting because on the one, I could, on the one hand, improving the standards around results would be good. On the other hand, is this so general that actually we're probably going slightly off at a tangent? So Nick Moody, if you're available, I just thought this is a space you've been delving into a lot recently, trying to deal in the divide between insurance and the developing world, if you had a view on that.
Well, you caught me out there slightly, Dickie. I was unfortunately I just had to pick up a different call, so I missed the first. I've missed the last about 2 minutes. Could you just repeat the question? I do apologise.
I did try by saying giving up beforehand, but so the question really was about we've been talking about the standardization of results, and that covers CAT modeling results, that covers 50-year flood maps, it covers crop yield, it covers all sorts of things. And I just wondered, with your experience sitting between the insurance industry in developing countries, whether or not you saw that a better use of standards around the descriptors around damage and results and loss would be useful in your experience. That's another 20 seconds you've gained to think about an answer.
Thank you. Well, I mean, the short answer to that is yes, and the reason is because in many respects we're starting with a cleaner canvas than perhaps we are if we just look at, for example, industry or indeed risk modelling for the wealthier countries. So, I mean, part of our agenda, as you know, is to help the more vulnerable and perhaps less resourced countries develop their own risk functions. And many of them are coming from the point of view where actually it would just be helpful to have a blooming hazard map. So we're really starting from a level where there is a blank enough canvas that's starting out with shared standards, both for the constituent components like exposure, but also actually for results, would be not just desirable, but actually the right thing to do, because it brings to them the opportunity to access and exchange the greatest number of models and data resources. I hope that might be helpful.
No, thank you. I think that is, and apologies for putting you on the spot. I mean, I can't remember the first time I had to explain to somebody what a 1 in 100-year event was, and then as that developed further, we've sort of defined what we think, we think you should use that term, but people all around the world don't, so you get stupid representations of it. So I think that would be great to have something better on that. I can see one hand up there, Jenty. Yes.
Yeah, no, thank you. I am a little bit nervous about this blank slate language. I definitely believe that there is a huge amount that can be done to strengthen damage and loss reporting, and I also believe that certainly in terms of the quality of the types of data that's needed to make insurance decision making, there is many of those many developing countries are at a point of having underdeveloped insurance sectors, and fully agree on that. I don't think that's the same as having a blank slate for hazard and loss reporting. And I also think it's important to recognize that actually in many of those contexts, there is a lot of damage and loss that is not going to be really reportable, or is not going to be really at a scale of being of interest to the insurance industry. And I think there may be, for example, a different type of categorization that may hit into the humanitarian side of things. So very much interested in being part of this conversation and believe that we can break this into chunks. But I'm just a little, having spent basically the last 20 years living in many contexts, in fact, God, at this point, almost 30 years living in many of those contexts that you would say are tabula rasa. I'm not sure how tabula rasa they are. There's actually some quite good stuff out there, but it may not be in the traditional workings, and it may not be usable to this particular community. And there may be different ways of getting to from A to Z. But just would want to highlight a couple of those points. Thanks. Thank you, Jenny. I actually sort of on the, as I was saying things about results, there's part of me that also says, maybe I said this, I can't remember that, but are we going too far? Is that beyond what we should be doing? Because there is a real danger in all of these standards. If you push too far and try and do too much, you become less effective at the core activities. And I think that's a very, very hard decision to make about when one should stop and when one should push further forward. Stuart.
Yeah, I think there's an important question of what the standard's communicating and how we communicate the applicability of different data sets. And a lot of this resides in standardizing the metadata, right? So people can search for a data set, find a data set, and understand what's contained within it, what the quality of the data is, and decide whether it's applicable to their use or not. Is it the right scale? Is it the right quality? Is it the right granularity, etc.? And I think that's what we hope to get to with the risk data library, communicating this or improving this understanding of the data sets. And that, I think the way we communicate that requires an understanding of how many different ways people are using the risk data, whether it is just as a view of a hazard map, whether it's overlaying exposure, whether it's for financial losses. So it's a conversation on user applications of these data sets. Conversation we've had previously in various contexts and various projects, but it's one that carries on, I think, and is one that we need to collaborate on in the future as well.
Okay, so I think I'm going to have one more question for anybody, and then we'll wrap up. So I think the last point, which is really fundamental, and perhaps in fact informed some of the early conversations that we had between us about this, is what's really important to keep this alive and dynamic and make it more successful and more valuable, therefore, to the communities it serves. So what should we be doing more of or less of? And you know, I know that's a hard question, but it really is an important one. And I know we would all appreciate the experience that any of you have around the table. So what should we be doing next, or more of, or less of, to make this really work and successful for all? Thoughts?
I can jump in if that's okay.
Please do.
I think from experience of similar things to this, I think you just need to get started, really. We need an example. You can spend a long time planning things out and overplan them. If we could see what a real model looked like in this standard and how people would start to use it, I think it'd be beneficial for me. It might just be me, but I certainly get a feel for how good something is by using it rather than just reading documentation about it. So I think if we could get some real worked examples and then go from there and actually see how people would use it, it would be beneficial.
I think it's a great idea. Thank you, Ben. I'm going to pick on a couple of people who I know reasonably well to see if we can get them. I'm going to do Mark Verst and then Paul Maisie if they're able to talk. So let's start with Mark, hoping he is. There you go.
Yeah.
Mark.
I have to admit I missed the middle part of the breakouts, but well, just following the rest of it, I thought, I mean, the socioeconomic vulnerabilities, they're also interesting to me. And if I say to me, then maybe less on the reinsurance and you know, the business side of things, but then we tend to learn a lot, right? If we also look at models from other angles, if we look at economic or even people affected losses or any variable that might express a damage or a loss or a pain or something, usually we also learn about the mechanics of the model, maybe even about the hazard, whether it covers the right area with footprints, with hazard maps, etc. So that's a point I wanted to bring in.
Very
if
kind.
You have a more specific question, please let me know. Dicky.
No, that's fine. That's very kind. Appreciate it. Paul, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Dicky. I guess slightly picking up maybe on what Ben said about having a more tangible model to work with. I think there's possibly opportunity to just eke out a little bit more space in some of the projects that are going on at the moment to start to build some of the things we need here. I mean, certainly at JBA we're working on at least one project at the moment where we are using data in different formats, and we're building the interfaces required there that can be then used more widely and shared more widely. But I think sometimes there's a need to get to the end of the project and deliver what's required, and that can possibly come at the expense of achieving slightly broader aims that are more beneficial, and that's probably not much more budget. It's just a little bit more focus on those tasks and just giving that a bit more priority. And I think when you've got a community here behind that pushing that as well, it just gives it a little bit more emphasis, which would be good. And just joining up then so that everyone's aware that that's going on.
That's great, Paul. Oh, sorry, Matt, I didn't see your hand was up. Apologies. I was looking at the list of attendees. Almost final word to you, probably.
No, that's okay. I mean, I just wanted to mention for 30 seconds or a minute is that we're talking very much and focus very much on the humanitarian and the non-insurance side, but I just sort of wanted to maybe spend a minute saying, and we've talked about it before, Dickie and Ben, previously last week, about what benefits having this information to the insurance sector. And I think one of the benefits of having more vulnerability and more open hazard data, which RDL can provide and are currently in their schemas, that isn't at the moment in ODS or on the OASIS platform, is around model validation and model testing, which is a big hurdle for the insurance industry, and certainly for those it's a highly regulated market, certainly the Lloyd's market as well. And I think having access to that information from an insurance perspective, and again on the commercial side, it will lower those barriers when it comes to adopting multi-models and looking at justifying the use of those models and what exactly goes into those models, and just having more transparency around that data in the insurance industry is going to help. Is going to help that. Now, I know we're talking more about the humanitarian side, but I just thought it'd be worth putting a couple of comments in there from the benefits of having it in the insurance sector.
No, well, thank you, Matt. And it's important because, of course, what we're trying to do is get the leverage from the scale and the size of the insurance industry to help solve some common goals, of which the two I mentioned right up front being, saving money, saving costs, and ultimately saving lives. I mean, that's, so I think it's a virtuous circle when we can get this right. And it's difficult, and it's hard to sort of galvanize, even in the formats we've got here today, some of the expertise we've got. But thank you all very much. I think I'm going to hand it back now to the two GFDRR organisers to sort of take us through the last couple of minutes and then see what next. Pierre, Stuart.
Yeah, over to you, Pierre. Thank you.
Okay, that's my slide. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Dickie, for driving this conversation, and thanks to all. I think we are almost 40 participants today to talk about standards. So I would say that's a success. But to me, to us, I believe that it's really a first step, and so. We like, so first of all, I wanted to say it again that, I mean, on behalf of GFDR, we are committed to support that process, right? To support the way forward, and to support the discussion, but not only the discussion, but also activities implementing actually disaster risk data standards. I think that's something very important that we just said, is that we can't, sit and discuss about standards if then after there is nothing happening. So we have to also produce. We have to provide the data. We have to showcase what can be done, and for that, surely having pilots, having specific programs is really the right way to do it. So this is why we're also going to work on an actual implementation of our own risk data library through a geoportal where you will be able to access all the data that are produced and collected at the bank. But what we also want to do is to continue to support others to well, implement a standard or to continue to discuss about that standardization process. So something I think as a next step. So a couple of information on that slide, but so and you have the links to the various material, various websites, and so on. But what I wanted to suggest maybe is to agree on to reconvene as a next step, maybe in 1 or 2 months, and to continue the conversation, maybe on some more specific issues that we identify today. I would say as a next step, I like also to see more people involved, in particular, and I think it was missing today, the beneficiaries of the work that we do. I think we need to be better at having more people from the countries that we are targeting, and so so developing countries for GFDRR. So this is really important, and it also relates to the way that we use standards to communicate. And I think it was a very important point that I always think that a good standard should be a standard that from which you could actually learn about disaster risk management, and so we have to think about that as well, how we communicate the work that we do to the people that should benefit from it. I think this is key point. And more concrete steps. So again, you have our contact, so don't hesitate to follow up with OASIS, with us. And so that's one thing. And so we will share with you the results of this workshop. We'll publish it probably on different websites, the summary. And yeah, so and again, so we have our different activities going on, so you can join them. On risk data, it's true that we still don't have let's say a steering committee, but something that we want to set up quite soon. And so what else? Now again, thanks a lot. I think it was really very interesting, at least for me. And again, so let's try to make something concrete out of that. Let's try to reconvene on concrete activities, programs, but also let's continue the conversation about standardization work. And from that, on that, you will hear from us very soon. So thanks again, and thanks to OASIS. It was really good to work with you and organizing this. I think Dicky, you suggested this workshop like 2-3 months ago, so it's I think a good achievement. So congrats to us, I think. Okay.
Well done, and thank you all very much.
Bye bye.
Cheers all.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Thanks, colleagues.